Hey guys, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and update 922 seems to be getting closer as the test server for it just went up yesterday. Today's video is going to let you know everything that I've been able to figure out so far about the test server, as well as outline all the dramatic changes to the Soviet tech tree, so let's get started. Firstly, Wargaming have made improvements to the matchmaker in the form of preventing you from getting in the same game mode again and again, so hopefully you won't get into an assault followed by an assault, or at least definitely not a grand battle followed by a grand battle. But anyway, let's get on to the tanks, the new Soviet tanks to be exact, and I presume that's why a lot of you are here. There are 3 new tier 10 Soviet tanks to be able to pick up in the next patch: the Object 2684, the Object 430U, and also the Object 705A. But I hasten to add that the reason why we're getting 3 new tanks is because 2 of the previous tier 10 vehicles in the form of the Object 263 and also the Object 430 are being moved down from tier 10 to tier 9 and replaced by those new vehicles. One other exciting aspect is that Wargaming are tantalizing us with 2 new coming soon vehicles that will lead on from the Object 432 and the T10. And so if you haven't already done so, I thoroughly recommend you uncheck accelerated crew training in your Object 430 version 2, your T10, and also your IS, because that's going to lead into a whole new heavy tank branch leading up to the Object 705A. So firstly, let's take a look at the brand new line of heavies leading on from the good old IS. The tier 8 is the ISM, and the whole point of this branch is their rear-mounted turreted tanks. The ISM has a big DPM advantage over the IS-3, but doesn't quite have the penetration, both with its standard rounds and also its premium rounds, which are limited to 240mm of pen. That's really not going to cut it against higher tiered vehicles. The shell velocity of this vehicle is also poor. The aim time better than the IS-3, but the accuracy worse. The vehicle isn't quite as fast, as it's limited at 35 km/h forwards, 12 backwards, a worse power to weight, and some better ground resistances. Its traverse speed is also worse than the IS-3, but where this vehicle has an advantage, of course, has to be the hull armor. Look at this, 130 at the front and 120 at the side, and a decent old turret. And upon closer inspection, we actually find out it's got 170mm of hull armor on the lower plate, and so that means, wow, pretty much tier 6 tanks just can't go through this tank frontally at all. And even if they load premium rounds, probably a 50-50 until the tank, of course, angles its lower plate armor. And now it's got 207mm. Not bad at all without having to over-angle its side armor. But wow, this is some very thick side armor on this tank. 120mm. It's only really things like the E75 that come to mind when I think about 120mm of side armor on this vehicle. So that means that when you angle this tank a bit like a KV-4 to the side like this, you've actually got about 220 to 240mm of side armor, and it's only the cheeks that you're going to have to worry about. This tank is clearly going to be a side-scraping monster with a decent old turret that doesn't seem to be overmatchable as well. Jumping up to tier 9, let's look at the Object 705. The tier 9 tank actually has a variety of competitive guns on it, 122mm and also 130mm, and funnily enough, this is the same gun that's on the IS-7, and so if you already have the IS-7, that makes getting this vehicle fully researched all the more easy. And you know what? +1 to Wargaming for not making this a unique gun and forcing us to spend an extra 60,000 free experience if we want to play it quickly. One also little thing that I noticed is that this gun, the 122mm, is shared with the Object 257, which, as I'm going to be highlighting later on, is the replacement for the T10. And so once again, if you have the T10 unlocked now or the IS-7, you're also going to get this gun unlocked, which then you can use on your Object 705. And so if you are interested in accelerating your progress up the new rear-mounted turreted Soviet heavy tank tech tree, then you probably want to get your hands on the IS-7 as well before. A lot like with the ISM, the Object 705 has a bit of a DPM advantage at tier 9, at least compared to the other Soviet heavy tanks. Its penetration is also not bad, 440 alpha, but if you want to use the IS-7 gun on this vehicle, then your DPM drops a little bit, but you still got 250mm of penetration and 490 alpha, nice for a Soviet tank. The aim time, not too bad compared to the ST1 at least, but the accuracy is horrible. Depression, not so good at 5 degrees. Wargaming clearly want you to use these rear-mounted turreted tanks at side-scraping or shooting at short to mid-ranges. Speed-wise, this vehicle isn't half bad. 40 km/h limited, a better power-to-weight ratio than the ST1, but slightly worse ground resistances. It's not going to be the most mobile, but not the least. And with a big old slab of hit points and 300mm of frontal turret armor, 155mm of side armor, it looks like the 704 is going to be a bit of a beast with regards to its durability. And let's take a look just how much here. 155mm of upper plate, but quite a weak lower plate on this tank. It's going to behave a bit like an ST1, but one thing that's interesting is its lower plate is actually very well angled here. So even though it's 120 millimeters, still 200 effective non-angled. And if you angle it like this, now it goes up to about 240. But just check out this turret, ladies and gentlemen. It's not really going to be overmatchable unless you're really above and shooting at the back of the tank. And you've got 300, wow, just 300 plus millimeters of armor. And when you side scrape like this, even the cheeks are not weak. This is going to be one of the most monster side scrapers in the game, and really they're going to have to shoot your cheeks with premium rounds. Not bad for a tier 9 tank. Now jumping up to tier 10, let's take a look at the Object 705A. And its speciality is that this Soviet tank has a 152mm caliber gun with 650 alpha damage, way above that of the IS-7 and the IS-4, but its DPM still isn't horrific. One thing that is very nice is that the aim time isn't bad on this tank as well at 2.8 seconds, but the accuracy 0.44, you're really not wanting to going to be sniping in this vehicle. The depression as well, disappointing at 5 degrees. The tank isn't exactly super slow for a vehicle that weighs 100 tons at 40 kilometers an hour forwards, and a fairly decent power to weight ratio of 15 to be able to get there. This feels very mobile for a 100-ton tank. And armor wise, well, this thing is a beast with 170 at the front of the hull, and even when unangled, the lower plate armor on this tank is 250 and the upper plate is 260. Just standard rounds aren't going to go through that from pretty much all vehicles apart from tier 10 tank destroyers, and as soon as it's angling that lower plate, it just gets even more brutal to be able to penetrate this tank. 260 when angled, and if you're over angling, it's 280. The upper plate now 290. Wow, this thing is solid, and look, it's pretty much like an IS-7 turret, 360 millimeters of protection all round here. Even premium rounds from tier 10 tanks are going to struggle to be able to go through it. But for a super heavy tank, so to say, the vehicle has really bad rear protection. Even on the side of the turret, it's not at all like the IS-7. The IS-7 will be bouncing all day long with the side. That's not the case with the 705A. But of course, considering this vehicle has that big old 152mm caliber gun, it'll be interesting to see how this thing plays out. I think it's going to be resilient. I think it's going to be great at trading, and it's going to be very good, of course, at side scraping. Next up, Wargaming have made no changes to the T10. We've seen that it's just shifted down, and it will lead on to that mystery tier 10 that is apparently coming soon, but it has a replacement in the form of the Object 257, and this is one of the most weird looking tanks I have ever seen. The hull shape on this tank is practically like a diamond. Look, you can see right through underneath it. And when we look at the armor model of this tank for a tier 9 vehicle, the armor doesn't look all that impressive, at least with the lower plate, 215 millimeters of effective. The top of the turret is overmatchable by all 91mm caliber guns, and it's got some fat cupolas on the tank as well that people will take advantage of. But remember that diamond shaped hull? Oh my word, this thing just looks absolutely ridiculous from above, below, and above also. And here's the thing, when your hull is shaped like this is going to be a lot like a T-22 medium tank. Look at this. When you angle the vehicle completely side on here, your whole mid plate is an auto ricochet, and your upper plate is still about 260 millimeters of effective armor. Now here's the thing, in this vehicle, when I was playing it, I was actually able to reverse side scrape. And when you go around a corner like this, imagine the calculator is the wall. Look at this, it looks like you should be able to penetrate, and you just simply can't. This thing is going to be an absolute and utter troll. One thing that is bizarre about the vehicle as well is that so many people in World of Tanks love to shoot the tracks when a vehicle is angled like this, to be able to not only damage the tracks but also go into the hull. But the tracks just seem like they're magically suspended, which means that your shell is just going to go through the tracks and then not hit anything at all afterwards. I expect this thing is going to cause massive frustration to players who don't know how to shoot it. But as with everything on the test server, things are subject to change, and we'll have to see if Wargaming let this one slip through. But compared to the T10, apart from the obvious armor upgrade that this tank is going to have, it doesn't really have the combat capacity apart from shell velocity. That's fantastic. Aim time worse, accuracy worse, turret traverse dispersion worse. Doesn't have the ground resistances at all, and its power to weight is fairly similar. It does have a better traverse speed, however, and it's got less view range. And so I presume this vehicle is going to be a less damage and speed orientated tier 10 that relies more on trolling its opponents with one of the most ludicrous armor models I've ever seen in World of Tanks. Next up, let's take a look at the Object 430U. I'm sure this one is going to be a bit of a hype beast. This is the new tier 10 Soviet medium tank, the replacement for the Object 430. So the key differences between the Object 430U and the previous Object 430, which has moved down to tier 9 and it's effectively replacing, is that it's not going to be focused on a wild DPM of the 3000, the highest DPM, well, the joint highest DPM of any medium tank in the game that the Object 430 had. Its DPM dropped significantly. Now this is kind of in between an E50M and something like a 121. Its penetration also drops to 252mm, but it still has 340mm heat shells if you want to try and pump that up a little bit. But look at the alpha damage increase, 440, up for 320. This is going to be the only tier 10 Soviet medium tank that has the 440 alpha. Everything else has 320. Unfortunately, this means the shell velocity significantly suffers, but the aim time is fantastic. 2.3 seconds, that's great for a high caliber gun, but the accuracy 0.4, that makes it, I think, the least accurate tier 10 medium tank in the game. The dispersion values actually get better, so it's absolutely bizarre that this tank hits harder but also has better gun handling that the 430 had. It's a slight bit slower at 50 kilometers an hour. Its power to weight ratio is worse. Its ground resistances are the same. But look at the armor, 160 millimeters of upper hull armor. When you're not angling this armor, it's about 270 millimeters of effective armor. And the side armor on this vehicle is very solid as well. It's 90 millimeters, and look how well it's angled down the upper part of the side hull here. That means that when you're kind of over angling, you're still going to be able to pull off ricochets. If, of course, they miss your tracks and take them off and also damage your hull at the same time. But one of the best things about the 430U is the turret. It's kind of got this T62A-like turret. The cupolas are not a weak point. You're going to have to hit them flush with a premium round to be able to go through. The front of the turret, same deal. And you're not going to be able to overmatch it at all unless you're using a really big gun like on the FV215B183 or the Jagdpanzer E100. All in all, the 430U sacrifices combat capacity and arguably some of its mobility to be able to gain a whopping amount of armor. But I just love the aim time on this vehicle. And stay tuned to the channel as I'll be doing a full preview of this vehicle and comparing it to tanks like the 121 to see if it stacks up. So what has Wargaming done to the Object 430 at tier 9? Well, they've absolutely butchered the gun. Look, 238mm of penetration on its standard rounds. That's not exactly fantastic for a tier 9 medium tank, but it's not awful like on the T54 if you choose to use the gun with nicer gun depression. And this gun also has 390 alpha. That's pretty good with a 6.19 rounds a minute rate of fire. That's not terrible. But the accuracy on this tank is abysmal, and also the premium penetration at 248. This tank is going to be a monster at tier 9 when it's dealing with tier 7 and tier 8 opponents that will find it very hard to be able to go through the hull and the turret on this tank, but it's going to absolutely struggle in a bad matchup where its armor just isn't very impressive at all and it doesn't have the penetration to contest with tier 10 vehicles. Next up, Wargaming have altered one of the least popular tank destroyer branches in the entire game, leading up towards the now Object 2684. The tier 7 SU-100M1 and the SU-100M1 were known as being glass cannon tank destroyers with incredible 100mm guns that had wild rates of fire and great accuracies. That's no longer the case. Wargaming have trashed the rate of fire on the 100mm on the SU-101, but they have significantly buffed the 122mm with regards to its aim time, its accuracy, and so this vehicle is going to feel a lot more like a Ferdinand or a Jagdpanther. But it's not just that. Wargaming have significantly buffed the armor on the tier 8 and tier 7 vehicles, so they're just going to feel a bit more like heavy frontal tank destroyers that will be able to bounce tanks inside good matchups, but inside your worst matchups, I think the vehicles are going to feel a little less efficient than when they were previously those glass cannons. Now the 263 previously was the tier 10 Soviet tank destroyer. Now it's being moved down to tier 9. And obviously when a vehicle moves from tier 10 to tier 9, there are going to be some significant nerfs to the tank. Firstly, the DPM has been trashed down to 2,156. Thinking about it, that is absolutely horrible. I presume this tank is now going to have the worst DPM, well, shall I say joint worst, with the T30 of any of the tier 9 tank destroyers. Its penetration also down to 270. That's not exactly awful for a tier 9, but it's certainly not great. Its premium pen 300. But look, it's had an aim time buff, but a dispersion nerf. But look at this, it's had an aim time buff, an accuracy nerf, and wow, that's a hell of a nerf. But a dispersion buff when moving, but a slight nerf when just turning the turret. It looks like Wargaming want you to play this as a snapshotting monster, presumably at short to mid-range combat and not a long-range sniper. They've also increased the engine power of this tank just a touch and haven't changed its armor at all and have retained most of its hit points, 1,800, but slashed its view range to 360, so it's most likely going to have to use binoculars now if you were using coated optics on this tank previously. But that means that this tank will be way more durable at tier 9 than it was at tier 10. And considering it's got all of the armor capacity that it previously had as a tier 10 tank destroyer, and that's going to make it a very scary vehicle if it manages to hide its lower plate, of course, and its side armor. But can you imagine if you do manage to hide the lower plate in this tank, what a tank's going to be able to do to you against this vehicle? Even with premium rounds, it's going to be scary to be in a tier 7 tank having to fight one of these. All in all, if you depended on the DPM of the Object 263 or you wanted to snipe at long range with the tank, then this vehicle pretty much might as well be dead to you. However, if you're somebody who likes to depend on the armor and get up into the faces of your opponents, then it's looking like it might be a very weird hybrid, mobile, brawling, crazy tank at tier 9. But some of you might be more interested in what is its tier 10 replacement. It's the Object 2684. Well, way to have a boring name scheme, Wargaming. But wow, the actual look of the tank isn't too boring at all, is it? I'd like to stress it doesn't come with this Black Widow camouflage. But what is it all about? Well, this vehicle has a 152mm caliber gun with 650 alpha. It has incredible aim time at 2 seconds, but again, mediocre accuracy at 0.42. And just to put that into perspective, this vehicle has a worse rate of fire than the Object 268 and 100 less alpha damage. Its penetration is just a touch worse, and it does get these kind of halfway in between premium rounds, 360mm of pen, not quite as good as the 395, but it's where the high explosive rounds just are absolutely useless on this tank. 840 alpha up from 650, that's not great compared to the 1100 that the 268 gets. Aim time wise, this trashes the 268, but accuracy wise, it's by far the worst tank. It doesn't have depression. It's quite fast though, and this is where this tank just gets absolutely crazy. 55 kilometers an hour forwards. It weighs 75 tons, has a 1,500 horsepower engine with a great power to weight ratio of 20. That makes this thing very mobile indeed, but it can't turn very quickly. 23 degrees a second will leave it vulnerable if it gets flanked. But look at the armor, 250mm with 2,100 hit points. And on closer inspection, this thing actually has 290mm of armor along the lower plate. So if your opponents are perfectly in front of you, just like this thing is going to be nigh on impenetrable, unless you're firing premium rounds and you get lucky. One thing that's weird is that Wargaming have kind of given it a weak point on top, but the weak point is still 250mm thick. And so what are tier 8 tanks meant to do against this frontally? Well, I guess they're not meant to sit in front of it. The vehicle also has a nice wide gun arc, 12 degrees to the left, 12 degrees to the right, and when you do angle that lower plate even more, it gets even better. And the fact that this thing is going to be so mobile and is able to snapshot like a complete boss, we're just gonna have to stay tuned to the channel when I do a full showcase of what it is capable of. And finally, Wargaming is sneaking in some of the, at least in my opinion, most unnecessary buffs to tier 8 Soviet premium medium tanks that I've ever seen. Look at this engine power increase on the T-54 first prototype from 520 up to 760. That means that this thing is now going to have a power to weight ratio of over 21, and it's going to be ludicrously mobile compared to what it was previously. I don't understand. The whole point of the T-54 Mod 1 is that it's a tank that does exceptionally well in a good matchup where it's able to use its 120mm of frontal hull armor, but it was meant to have a bad gun, which they've now buffed, and mediocre mobility, which they've now buffed. This thing is looking absolutely scary at tier 8 Soviet medium. I just don't know why they needed to do it. Next up, T-44-100, maybe a vehicle that I could have used a little bit of love, but look at this. Decreased dispersion when moving and turning the hull by 40%. Okay, that thing's going to be able to snapshot like a boss. It's also now able to go backwards at 23 kilometers an hour, and it's got a big old power to weight buff. And so I guess there'll be more reason than ever for next patch to get into your tier 8 Soviet premium medium tanks and drive around like a crazy Ivan. But of course, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, maybe you don't give a darn about all of these Soviet tanks, then at least I've got some good news for you, and that is probably the most important change of the 922 update is that the AMX-40, the duck tank, has been remodeled into HD. And so I present to you the HD duck, the AMX-40 Yeah, you'd have to be quackers to want to play this vehicle that much. Next, Wargaming are making changes to the ranked battles. A season will last an entire 21 days, and it is not divided into stages, so I guess that kind of weekly anxiety of having to grind every week through the season will be gone. But they're also increasing the ranks from 5 to 15, and they've made it easier to be able to get chevrons now, and that's because the top 10 players on the winning team and the top player on the losing team will receive a chevron, and the top 3 players on the winning team will receive an additional chevron, meaning they pick up 2. Furthermore, players who position 2 to 5 on the losing team will retain a chevron and not lose one. So what this effectively means is that the system is now going to be chevron positive, with 13 chevrons being awarded to the winning team and 9 being taken away overall from the losing team. And so for every single game that's played, 4 chevrons will go into the system. This should make it easier than the previous system for players with a lot of time to be able to climb the ladder. But unfortunately, that means that if you're very skilled, you're going to have to probably play a lot more to be able to keep up with the players who have no lives. But we'll just have to see if Wargaming continue to rework this. Furthermore, Wargaming have added new functionality in the form of a rank shield, where some ranks will be shielded and the shield will have a particular number of durability points. As we can see here, rank 5 has 3 hit points, which are apparently fully restored when 1 chevron is received. So I presume that Wargaming are trying to make steps up along the way, so you can't have an evening where you've just had absolutely terrible games and then drop rank. So hopefully that will prevent the rank anxiety and trying to encourage people to make their steps up. And so all in all, it looks like there are going to be far more rewards available. That's 1 credit booster, 2, 3. Wow, you could get 23 credit boosters per season. Remember, that is 46 hours of plus 50% credits, with some fairly meaty bonuses at the end to at least claw back some of those premium rounds that you'll undoubtedly be firing. And so ladies and gentlemen, that about covers it for the 9.22 update. Huge changes to the Soviet tank tree. I'm sure that's going to be very popular with players who do have Soviet tanks, but I'm sure there's going to be a lot of you who have no interest in playing Soviet vehicles who will look at this as kind of an intermediate patch of nothing before, of course, the big one, 1.0, comes out in March. And so I hope you enjoyed this video, or it was just useful to you. If it was, please give it a thumbs up, but if you absolutely hated it, give it a thumbs down, and let me know in the comments what you think about all of these new Soviet tech tree changes. Do you think any of the tanks that I showcased look absolutely crazy overpowered, and do you think any of them look absolutely useless? Are you an Object 263 driver? What do you think about the changes? Are you an Object 430 lover? What do you think about the Object 430U? And stay tuned to the channel, as I'm going to be releasing detailed videos on all of the tier 10 tanks in the upcoming days. And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.